The world survived a global war once, but instead of peace, it inherited anger, humiliation, and a desire for revenge. How did humanity move from fragile stability to the greatest catastrophe in history? Who was truly responsible for the outbreak of the Second World War? And could it have been stopped? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like if you want to understand history, not just memorize dates. Here, we explore the events that reshaped the world, honestly, in depth, and beyond the myths. And now, let's move on to the video. The origins of the Second World War. A historical narrative with analytical perspective. A world that never healed. 1918 to 1929. The Second World War was not born in a single moment of aggression, nor did it emerge solely from the ambitions of one nation or one man. It was the final explosion of a world that had been quietly cracking for decades. When the guns of the First World War fell silent in November 1918, Europe did not enter an era of peace. It entered an era of exhaustion, resentment, and unresolved trauma. The war had ended, but its consequences continued to poison international relations, shaping a future that would eventually descend into even greater catastrophe. The Great War had shattered the old order. Empires that had ruled for centuries collapsed almost overnight. The German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire all disappeared or were transformed beyond recognition. In their place rose fragile republics, unstable monarchies, and artificial states drawn on maps by diplomats who often ignored history, ethnicity, and local realities. These new borders created not stability, but tension that simmered beneath the surface throughout the interwar years. At the heart of the post-war settlement stood the Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919. Intended to secure lasting peace, it instead planted the seeds of future conflict. Germany, blamed for the war through the infamous War Guilt Clause, was stripped of territory, military power, and economic independence. The treaty demanded massive reparations, reduced the German army to a symbolic force, and humiliated a nation that had not been invaded or decisively defeated on its own soil. To many Germans, Versailles was not a peace treaty, but a national humiliation. The loss of Alsace-Lorraine to France, the creation of the Polish corridor cutting East Prussia from the rest of Germany, and the demilitarization of the Rhineland were seen as deliberate attempts to cripple the nation permanently. The emotional impact of this humiliation cannot be overstated. It fostered a sense of betrayal, anger, and victimhood, emotions that would later be exploited with devastating effectiveness. Meanwhile, the victors of the war were far from united. France, having suffered immense destruction, demanded harsh measures to prevent Germany from ever threatening it again. Britain, while officially supporting the treaty, quietly feared that a weakened Germany would destabilize Europe and disrupt trade. The United States, despite President Woodrow Wilson's idealistic vision of a new international order, withdrew into isolationism, refusing to ratify the treaty or join the League of Nations. The very institution designed to preserve peace was thus weakened from the moment of its creation. The League of Nations symbolized both hope and failure. In theory, it was meant to resolve conflicts through diplomacy rather than violence. In practice, it lacked enforcement mechanisms, military power, and the participation of key nations. Decisions required unanimous agreement, making decisive action almost impossible. As the 1920s progressed, the League became a forum for speeches rather than solutions, its authority steadily eroding. Germany itself struggled to survive in the post-war world. The newly formed Weimar Republic faced overwhelming challenges: political extremism on both the left and the right, economic collapse, and widespread social unrest. Hyperinflation in 1923 turned savings into worthless paper, destroying the middle class and deepening distrust in democratic institutions. For ordinary Germans, democracy became associated not with freedom, but with chaos, weakness, and national shame. Yet Germany was not alone in its instability. Across Europe, nations wrestled with similar problems. Italy, despite being on the winning side of the war, felt cheated by the peace settlement. Promised territories were denied, and the country descended into strikes, violence, and political paralysis. In Eastern Europe, newly created states such as Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia contained deep ethnic divisions that threatened their very existence. Beyond Europe, the balance of power was also shifting. Japan, strengthened by its wartime gains, began to see itself as the dominant power in East Asia. However, it too felt constrained by international agreements that limited its naval expansion and economic ambitions. The seeds of resentment were being planted far from the battlefields of Europe, in regions that would later become central theaters of war. The 1920s are often remembered as a decade of recovery and relative stability, but this image is misleading. While certain economies experienced brief periods of growth, the foundations of peace remained dangerously fragile. International cooperation was shallow, nationalism was intensifying, and the memory of war had not faded. It had merely hardened into bitterness. Beneath the surface of diplomatic conferences and economic plans, a dangerous idea was spreading. The belief that force, not compromise, was the true path to national revival. The First World War had been described as the war to end all wars, yet its unresolved legacy ensured that another, even more destructive conflict was already taking shape. By the end of the 1920s, the world stood at a crossroads. Peace existed, but it was an uneasy peace, one maintained not by trust or reconciliation, but by exhaustion and fear. When that fear faded, and when new crises emerged, the fragile structure built after 1918 would begin to collapse with alarming speed. And when it did, the consequences would be far greater than anyone in 1919 had imagined. The origins of the Second World War. A historical narrative with analytical perspective. Economic collapse and the rise of extremism. 1929 to 1933. The fragile peace of the post-First World War world did not collapse all at once. It fractured under pressure, slowly at first, then with terrifying speed. That pressure arrived in the form of economic disaster. The Great Depression, triggered by the Wall Street crash of October 1929, struck the global economy like a seismic shockwave, exposing the deep structural weaknesses of the international system and accelerating political radicalization across entire continents. In the late 1920s, the global economy appeared stable on the surface, but it rested on a dangerously fragile foundation. International trade depended heavily on American loans and investments, particularly in Europe. Germany, still burdened by war reparations, relied almost entirely on U.S. credit to sustain its economy and meet its obligations. When American banks collapsed and recalled their loans, the German economy imploded almost overnight. Factories closed, businesses failed, and unemployment soared to unprecedented levels. By 1932, more than 6 million Germans were unemployed. For millions of families, hunger and despair replaced hope. Soup kitchens became symbols of a broken society, and democratic promises sounded hollow in the face of daily survival. Economic misery did not simply weaken faith in the Weimar Republic, it shattered it. In times of crisis, moderate voices are often drowned out by extremes. The Depression created fertile ground for radical ideologies that offered simple answers to complex problems. Communists blamed capitalism and called for revolution. Nationalists blamed foreign powers, minorities, and internal traitors. Democracy, caught between these forces, appeared powerless and indecisive. No figure exploited this atmosphere more effectively than Adolf Hitler. A failed artist turned political agitator, Hitler transformed personal bitterness into a mass movement. Through emotionally charged speeches, he promised national rebirth, economic recovery, and revenge against those he claimed had humiliated Germany. His message was not built on reason or compromise, but on emotion, fear, and resentment, and it resonated deeply with a population desperate for change. The Nazi Party portrayed itself as a force of order in a world descending into chaos. It blamed Germany's suffering on the Treaty of Versailles, on democratic politicians, and on scapegoated minorities. While these claims were rooted in distortion and hatred, they were delivered with such conviction that many began to see them as truth. The Nazis offered not policy details, but certainty, a powerful weapon in uncertain times. By 1932, the Nazi Party had become the largest party in the German parliament. Yet Hitler did not seize power through a violent revolution. Instead, he was appointed Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, the result of political miscalculations by conservative elites who believed they could control him. They were catastrophically wrong. Once in power, Hitler moved swiftly to dismantle democratic institutions. The Reichstag fire, blamed on communists, provided a pretext for emergency decrees that suspended civil liberties. Political opponents were arrested, intimidated, or silenced. Within months, Germany had been transformed from a fragile democracy into a totalitarian state. Germany was not alone in its descent into authoritarianism. Across Europe, the Depression fueled similar movements. In Italy, Benito Mussolini, who had come to power earlier in 1922, used the crisis to solidify his fascist regime. He presented himself as the embodiment of national strength, promising order and imperial revival. In Spain, economic hardship and political polarization pushed the country towards civil war. In Eastern Europe, democratic governments collapsed one by one, replaced by authoritarian regimes that promised stability at the cost of freedom. The idea that democracy was weak and inefficient spread rapidly. Dictatorship, once feared, began to appear efficient, decisive, and modern. Meanwhile, in Japan, the effects of the global economic downturn intensified militaristic tendencies. Dependent on foreign markets and raw materials, Japan saw expansion as the only solution to economic vulnerability. Military leaders gained influence, arguing that national survival required territorial conquest. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, marking one of the first major acts of aggression that would lead toward global war. The response of the international community to these developments was hesitant and ineffective. The League of Nations, already weakened, proved incapable of enforcing its principles. Condemnations were issued, but no meaningful action followed. This failure sent a clear message to aggressive powers. The international system lacked both the will and the strength to stop them. The Great Depression did more than destroy economies. It destroyed faith. Faith in cooperation, in compromise, and in the idea that peace could be maintained through reason alone. As unemployment lines grew longer and desperation deeper, radical leaders gained followers by promising clarity in a world that no longer made sense. By 1933, the path toward another global conflict was becoming visible. Extremism had moved from the margins to the center of political life. Aggressive ideologies were no longer fringe ideas, they were state policies. The fragile structure of peace built after the First World War was beginning to collapse, not with a single blow, but with a series of deliberate steps toward confrontation. The world had entered a dangerous new phase, one in which economic despair fueled political extremism, and extremism, in turn, reshaped the destiny of nations.